2 weeks ago, Canada and the United States were able to reach a new trade agreement, the new USMCA. It makes some tweaks to a variety of trade rules among the US, Canada, and Mexico. And now to share how that agreement came together, please join me in welcoming Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Chrystia Freeland, with Fortune's Nina Easton.
So I started profusely thanking Chrystia for being here. We were on stage together a couple years ago in 2017 in the, oh my God, it's only been 1 year, Fortune Most Powerful Women. But I started profusely thanking you for being here, and very Canadian-like, you started profusely thanking us for hosting this event in Canada. So
well, I am very grateful that Fortune is here. I'm happy to see my friend Alan Murray. Great to see you, Alan. And no, this is Canada. I think our whole country, our government is delighted that Fortune is doing this event here. I am a Toronto Member of Parliament. My riding, my constituency starts about 1 kilometer north of where we are. Okay. So this is home turf, and I hope everyone is having a great time.
We are, and thank you so much for being here. A lot has happened since you and I talked last time in 2017. A lot of headlines, free trade, we're going to get to that in a minute. But first, I want to get to the headlines about Saudi Arabia, because one of the things that's completely underreported in the United States is this chapter in Canada where you personally had some interesting interaction with Saudi Arabia. You tweeted, it started with a tweet, you tweeted a concern about, or demand for the release of 2 dissidents. The Saudis reacted pretty strongly. They tried to almost cut off relations by recalling their ambassador, by stopping air travel, and students, I guess, college students as well, who are Saudis and were teaching here, or excuse me, were going to school here. They called them home. What is the status of all of that right now, first of all? And what did you learn about the Saudi regime going through that?
Well, I think Alan spoke with the Prime Minister about that yesterday. And, you know, the Prime Minister said, was very clear about Canada's position, which is Canada really believes that it is important to speak about human rights in the world. We think, obviously, it's important to do so politely, to do so from a position of humility and appreciating that we are far from perfect ourselves. Certainly when it comes to Canada's record on our relationship with the Indigenous people in Canada, there's a lot more we can and should and need to do, and we think it's important to be upfront about that. Having said that, we feel that it is very important in our foreign policy to speak up for human rights, very much including women's rights and the rights of feminist activists, and we will continue to do that. And we make no apology for doing that. So that is our longstanding position, and that was our position over the summer. Since that time, I've had a lot of conversations with Adel, the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia. He has been very keen to have a dialogue, which we're always happy to have. And what we've said in those conversations is, you know, what we're saying now, that for Canada, having a relationship with Saudi Arabia obviously is important. We have a deep and long-standing ties with Saudi Arabia. Having said that, we will always speak up for human rights.
So what's the status of all of that? All of those, was that sort of a lot of smoke and nothing really transpired in terms of cutting off air travel and recalling the ambassador and so forth? Where are we on all that?
No measures were taken, for sure.
No measures were taken? No, measures were taken. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
Full stop. Measures were taken.
So what is the status? You can fly to Riyadh from the airport right now?
Yeah? So those weren't measures taken by us.
Right, obviously.
I believe the flights are still suspended, but that's worth checking. On the students, there's been some moderation, and certainly Canada's position when it comes to the Saudi students is we love foreign students. I hope that people who are visiting Toronto are having a great time, and I hope you'll all send your kids to study here, or as adults, you can come and study in Canada too. So we're very glad to have students from Saudi Arabia and all countries in the world study here, and we hope to make them welcome.
So on the allegations that the Saudi regime potentially murdered a Washington Post columnist, Saudi citizen resident of the United States, what insight can you give us? What conversations have you had with your counterpart?
Well, look, I think it's important to start by saying that it is really important to have a free press in the world. It's very important that journalists be able to work free from harm. And, you know, I'm a former journalist. Yeah, it is. Come on, let's cheer for journalists. And these are very dangerous times for journalists in the world. And I, maybe as a former journalist particularly, but I think any Canadian foreign minister would feel that it's really important to speak up for journalists. It's important to be very clear that certainly for our democracies to function, but I think for the world to function, we need journalists to be able to work without fear for their lives in safety. So that is the first thing to be very, very clear about. There are some very worrying questions about the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Canada has raised the issue directly with Saudi Arabia, and we are talking about the issue with our allies. I've had a good conversation with Secretary Pompeo, who is very engaged. We're working very closely with Secretary Jeremy Hunt of the UK, with Heiko Maas of Germany, really with all of our G7 allies. And we think that it is very important that there be a clear, transparent investigation. We need to know what has happened, and those responsible need to be held to account.
So what do you make
I also spoke to the Turkish foreign minister yesterday, and that's important, I think, for us also to acknowledge the real interest that Turkey has in this issue.
Well, speaking of Turkey, I mean, there's word that they want to be paid off essentially by Saudi Arabia in order not to release incriminating evidence. What do you make of that? What do you make of the stories that the regime, the Saudi regime, is wanting to come up with a claim that these were rogue security agents? What's your take on that?
Well, you know, as I said, Nina, it's one of the transitions I had to make from being a journalist to being a politician and now a minister is we can't deal in allegation. We can't traffic in rumor. What I can say is this is a very worrying situation. The fate of Jamal Khashoggi is something that Canada is concerned about, and there are a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Well, what about, I'm wondering too if this is a transformative moment for both Canada and U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. Senator Lindsey Graham just called the Crown Prince a wrecking ball. What's your take on that?
I saw Senator Graham's comments. I did speak with Senator Bob Corker on Friday. We appreciate the role that the Senate has in the United States, including in foreign policy. I've met with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so it was good to speak to Senator Corker about the issue. And, you know, I think we've spoken about where Canada is with Saudi Arabia. It's for the U.S. to speak about its relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Okay. You know, we've talked about this earlier today here because it's also one of these instances which raises a very difficult and in some ways kind of an epic moment for business leaders, in that more and more CEOs in liberal democracies believe they want to be purpose-driven. They proclaim they're purpose-driven. They believe in rights. We've had CEOs sit right here and say it's important to call out bad. And yet, in a lot of regimes, we know bad happens, but it's kind of there, you know, it's around there. This was right in your face. And of course, you had the Davos in the Desert conference coming up next week. But the allegations, and again, they haven't been proven, but it was one of those situations that's just right in your face, and you have to make a decision, and you have to say something about it in a lot of cases, and yet a lot of companies have a lot on the line. You have SNC here, which has had to deal with that. What do you have to say about that and wrestling with that question?
Yeah. You know, I think that is an excellent question, and it's a question that governments face as well, because speaking up for human rights, particularly in the world today, can sometimes come with a price. As the Prime Minister said very clearly to Alan yesterday, Canada still believes very clearly that there is an imperative to speak up for human rights. And you know, I've been thinking about this a lot, and a person whose writing I urge everybody to read about this is one of my life heroes, Andrei Sakharov. Mm-hmm. And Sakharov had this really brilliant thing to say about it, which is he believed that there was a moral imperative for those of us who live in free societies to speak up for human rights, and that we shouldn't undervalue the impact that has on people who don't enjoy the privileges we have. But he had another thing to say, which maybe people aren't as familiar with, which is speaking up for human rights is not only the moral thing to do, it's actually the practical thing to do. Because you will generally find that in places where human rights are abused, regimes that abuse human rights routinely, you might find they're not the best partners.
Though there are some who would argue that investing and doing business in those companies and in those countries and talking to them informally behind the scenes is really the way to have influence.
Look, I think that it is always important to have conversations. Right. Talking is always valuable, and it's important to have private conversations. But I do think it's a mistake, and it can be, frankly, a self-serving mistake, to think that a private conversation is always an equally effective substitute to taking a public stand. And sometimes it's important to take a public stand.
So let's turn to trade, to NAFTA, which is, interestingly enough, the North American Free Trade Agreement's now become 3 countries listed, USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, which the optics of that are fascinating. And you had a very long, difficult year of ups and downs. You've described
I believe it was 14 months.
Was it 14 months? Okay, you're counting.
I can tell you how many hours.
It's like,
that I'm just teasing.
What did you do when you finally sign it? What did you do that night? Did you celebrate somehow?
I laid down on the ground in the Prime Minister's office.
You laid down?
I did. That is true.
You were just, and just flopped because you, out of exhaustion or thrill, yes, or everything, yes, everything. So what did you learn through this journey, shall we call it, about the MO of the White House and President Trump? Like, now that you've been through this, you have a lot to offer about what the strategy and the MO of that White House is.
Well, you know, I have a couple of thoughts about that, Nina. One is, the day before the negotiations started, we made some opening remarks in Ottawa. And one of the things I said then was that there would be some moments of drama, and that people should be prepared for that. Now, I didn't say that because I have some kind of a crystal ball. I did turn out to be right. But it's worth bearing in mind, trade negotiations always have moments of drama. I mean, trade negotiations are this odd thing where on the one hand, they can be incredibly technical about really, really specific technical issues. And on the other hand, they're punctuated by these really dramatic moments. And Canadians were sort of familiar with that because we had just concluded a trade agreement with the European Union, where at one point I had had to walk out of negotiations with the Walloons. Wallonia is a province of Belgium. So we as a country were familiar with that. I was a little bit personally familiar with it.
Yeah, but you weren't, but this was very personal. I mean, let's be real. And
It was personal with the
You were
Walloons
described as someone who
also.
doesn't like America. You were attacked personally. I mean, this was a reality show drama that is, I've seen a lot of trade agreements too. This was a little different.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, you know, I think drama is, notwithstanding the dryness of trade negotiations, drama is also par for the course.
So what would be your advice to negotiating with Donald Trump from here on?
Okay, well, I'll tell you how Canada actually generally negotiates, and for us, I think it worked. So for us, our approach was to always be polite. We try to always be friendly. That is sort of our national way. We believe strongly in using fact-based arguments, and we did that. But to know what your bottom lines are and to be prepared to stand firm in defense of the national interest. And we were absolutely clear about that. And ultimately, I think that was understood. I do think that for us, maybe the final point that was very important for Canada is we had an extremely united Team Canada approach. Our cabinet was totally united. Our caucus, that means all of the MPs were united. But it went beyond that. There was a real sense that the country was united. We put together at the beginning a NAFTA council, which is going to meet on Friday, and it included 2 former cabinet ministers from the Conservative government, including the former interim leader of the Conservative Party. It included a senior NDP leader. It included the Canadian equivalent of the head of the AFL-CIO, Hassan Youssef. It included Perry Bellegarde, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nation, senior business figures. So it was a really pan-Canadian thing. And really, we felt as a country, we approached this in a united way. That was absolutely essential because when you're in, and there were tense moments, you're quite right, Nina, and difficult moments, we never felt we had to watch our backs. So I'm grateful to Canadians. I really am. And like people were sometimes like, people who are not Canadian have no idea how much this was a real national, it was a real national thing. Like people would actually stop me in the supermarket and just give me a hug. Someone offered me, because I travel economy class on one of the flights back from Washington, someone offered me their seat in business class. I mean, people were just like so nice, but what I would call Canadian nice, resolute and nice. And that was really important.
Well, it's interesting, too, because you gave a terrific speech in Washington during this. And by the way, you talked about the decline of liberal democracy. You talked about Frank Fukuyama's book being wrong. It's not the end of history, that we've got this rise of authoritarianism, which we talked about on stage earlier today. But you also talked about...
You should get Robert Kagan here, because he has a great new book on these issues.
And you know, but you kind of denounced the mano a mano approach to policy, and that you needed to, and you said liberal democracies need to raise their game in order to confront authoritarianism. It's interesting. I wonder with Canada, is Canada ready to kind of take more of a lead? You talk about being polite and nice. Are you ready to take more of a lead on the world stage? And if so, what is that going to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are.
Give me some examples.
I think you're starting to see it. Well, I think you're seeing Canada speaking out about human rights in many parts of the world. Canada has taken a real leadership role when it comes to the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And we actually had a unanimous consent motion. That means all members of parliament supported it, naming the crimes against the Rohingya in Myanmar for what they are, which is a genocide. It's important to be clear about that and to use that word. When it comes to trade, Canada believes really strong, trade and actually the international order in general. We believe very strongly in the rules-based international order. That very much includes the WTO. My colleague Jim Carr, the Minister of Trade and Diversification, who I think was here yesterday, right, is chairing a meeting of like-minded countries around how we can reform and strengthen the WTO. So you're seeing in a lot of areas.
So we're going to see the WTO modernizing, much like NAFTA modernized. Is that the...
I don't know if I would say that, but I think the WTO does need to be made fit for purpose in the 21st century. And at the same time, we need to not lose the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, which is under threat right now. And without that, we do not have rules of the road for global trade. That is a huge problem.
So with your sort of more high-profile position on the world stage, talk about China and how your approach to China might be different than the United States approach.
Well, that is a really interesting question, and I thought you might
And you have a really interesting answer.
I'll try. You know, I thought you might ask about China because obviously at a business conference, one does need to talk about the second largest economy in the world, an economy that will, you know, certainly within our lifetimes be the largest economy. And I think the first thing to say is Canada's trade with China is growing very, very fast. So between April and August of this year, our trade with China increased by 23%. We think that is a really good thing.
Some people are, by the way, there's some who speculate that that's replacing trade with the U.S. Is that some of the...
I mean, when you impose tariff barriers, then countries tend to look for other places to get stuff from.
Okay.
It's a thing that happens.
Okay.
You know, that's what barriers do. They create a barrier.
Right.
And, you know, certainly trade with China can be challenging. An issue that is personally very close to me, I'm going to surprise you, this will be something you've probably never heard of, Nina, is canola. Do you know what that is? It's a very lovely yellow flower. You make oil out of it. My dad happens to be a canola farmer, and Canada is a huge canola producing country. And we had a difficult time with China when we formed government because, you know, as I'm sure you guys talked a lot about the non-tariff barriers to trade, right? So it doesn't have to be a tariff. There can be a number of regulatory hurdles, or when it comes to agricultural products, often sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. And we were facing a barrier like that when it came to canola. And so I was trade minister at the time. I traveled with the prime minister to China, and I wanted to make it personal. So I insisted on getting a jar of canola actually grown by my dad that I brought with me. I needed a special permit because you need permits to export canola from Canada to China, so it was quite complicated. But I had a jar. My dad FedExed it to Toronto, and I brought that jar of canola to China, and with the Prime Minister, we showed it to the Premier, and we said, this is personal for us. We grow canola, it's great. Chinese families love to use the canola oil in their kitchens. Please, let's get serious and let's remove these barriers. And it worked. Our canola trade with China has increased hugely since then.
So what do you think about the U.S. Relationship with China right now when it comes to trade, which some would describe as somewhat of a trade war?
You know, I think that there are some serious, obviously, you know, this is something that I've spent a lot of time with Ambassador Lighthizer over the past 14 months. And a point that he makes, which I think is a good one, is that there are some serious concerns that I think many countries share when it comes to trade with China. issues like forced technology transfers. And those are important issues for us to be addressing. I think they're issues that all of us in our own bilateral relationships with China have been raising. And it's important to address those. Having said that, you know, Canada has its own economic relationship with China. And from our perspective, we see tremendous economic opportunity. You know, the reality, and I think something that I imagine you guys have been addressing, you know, I was going to say as business journalists, I guess I'm not a business journalist anymore, but when I was a business journalist and now as a minister, when you sort of step back and you say, what is the big thing happening in the 21st century? Obviously, one of the big things happening in the 21st century is what Fareed Zakaria described as the rise of the rest. In that post-war period, we, you know, the United States, Canada, eventually Western Europe, existed in this weird moment, but especially North America, where the world had been devastated and we were uniquely large compared to the rest of the world. And since then, we've been part of a great thing, which is our own economies have grown, our own people have prospered. But we, and this was very much a process under US leadership, were part of building up everybody else. And it started with tremendous US leadership in the post-war reconstruction of Western Europe and Japan. We got rich together. And I would say the story of the past 30 years has been about other parts of the world catching up and getting richer too. And nowhere has that been more pronounced than in Asia, and particularly when it comes to numbers of people in China. Hundreds of millions of people have risen out of extreme poverty into the middle class. That changes how the world works. And I think there are two key things about that. One is how I think we want the world to work going forward is to bring these emerging powers into the rules-based international order, to say we have built an open system, an open rules-based multilateral system in which we have prospered. This is not a closed club, though. It's open to you. Join us, be part of this system, but please, you're going to have to play by these rules. And you can join us in the discussion about what those rules should be like. But I think that getting that balance right is in many ways the key challenge of the 21st century. And if we get it really right, it can be really great for the whole world.
So that's on a positive note. We're going to end on a slightly negative note.
No, Nina.
What worries you most?
Oh my God, what worries me most? Okay, I'm going to say two things worry me most. I have to say climate change. After the UN report last week, there's a great, for visitors to Toronto, can I urge everyone to go to the Art Gallery of Ontario? It's just up the street from here. There is a brilliant exhibit called Anthropocene by some great Canadian artists. One of them lives in at least one of them lives in my constituency, Ed Bertinsky, and it is amazing photographs of the human impact on the planet. And looking at it, you really see the impact that we're having, and we have to deal with it. I have 3 kids. I am very conscious that, you know, I turned 50 this summer. I need the world to last not just long enough for me to have an okay old age, but I'd like my kids to have a great life too. And, you know, we're sort of running out of road there. So that's one. And then the second is what you've already referred to. I do really believe we have to fight in a way we haven't since before the Second World War for our own liberal democracies. I think the very idea of a liberal democracy with a free press, with a rules-based constitutional order, with a in Canada we call it the loyal opposition, Her Majesty's opposition. That's a great way to think of political dissent, right? That dissent is not a bad thing, that disagreeing with the guys, for us, it's on the other side of the aisle. They're not bad people because they hold different opinions. Quite the contrary, they're an essential part of that political system. So all of these elements of liberal democracy, I think we really need to be concerned about. They are in jeopardy in various ways in various parts of the world. There is this sort of angry populist nativism that we're seeing be remarkably successful in a number of places that is premised on a very different set of views about the world, also about treatment of minorities, minority rights, a key part of how a democracy works. So that I worry about a lot too.
So that was a half hour that went by way too fast. And Chrystia, I just want to thank you, as do all of us, for being an incredible voice in advocating liberal democracy and the values of liberal democracy all the way across the board. Thank you, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.